excited to be sharing the virtual stage with you once again. Lovely Kate Forsyth. No, I should rephrase it. Dr. Kate Forsyth. She's a doctor of fairy tales. I think that's amazing. It's like one of the best things ever. Kate and I go way back. I have to say, I think the first time I met you, Kate, was 2012. You were my first author at Reader's Review, the first one. So it was an absolute pleasure to have you on board as our special guest. And you've come back for more, and I've seen you at different cons. But tonight we're going to talk all about Kate, her work, her writing. So if you have any questions, please feel free to send them through. Before we kick off with our conversation, let's get Kate to answer the first question that's come through. So that was from LT. LT, thank you so much for your question. Hi, Kate. Do your characters talk to you in your head all day? Very good question.
I'm afraid that they do. Yes. Quite often I'll be kind of gazing out the window with a vacant expression on my face, and my children will want to know what I'm staring at. And of course, I'm not staring at anything. I'm a million miles away in the world within my head, listening to the voices of my characters. And they speak to me in my dreams as well.
Yeah. I remember you telling us that the first time I met you at Reader's Review, that some of it, was it the puzzle ring? I think it might have been your children's book came to you in a dream, or at least the plot of it came to you in a dream. And you woke up, you wrote it down, but then you had to ask yourself questions like, did they even use a toothbrush back in the time which we're setting? So it's, yeah, I love it. Here we go. I love that. Thank you, LT said. Thank you very much for your question. Let's go down a trip to memory lane, Kate. So let's have a look at your works and your books. Can you tell us about your debut novel, your very first novel? What was that? When was that? And how did it come to you?
So The Witches of Ilianan was actually my very first published book. I'm trying to do the maths in my head, but it's got to be about 26 years ago, I think. So I was in my 20s. That's how old I am now. The idea of The Witches of Ilianan, did come to me in a dream, and the dream kind of stayed with me for a very, very long time. I had been working on a novel for my Masters of Arts in creative writing, and I had finished it and delivered it. So I thought, well, I need something new to work on. I've been working on that one for about 5 or 6 years. So I thought, I had this amazing, fantastical dream that had kind of haunted my imagination. So I began to just write it, around the dream. And by the end of the day, I thought I was writing a short story. By the end of the day, I had what was clearly a first chapter, and I had an idea for a novel. By the end of the week, I knew I was writing a trilogy, and by the end of the next month, I knew it was going to be more than a trilogy. And I think the whole Witches of Ilianan series now, there are 9 books and well over 1 million words in the whole series.
Wow.
And this, Annie, this book just changed my life. I'd always wanted to be a writer. I'd been writing ever since I was a little girl. I'd been trying to get published since I was 16. By this time, I'd been, rejected for more than a decade, probably, 12, 13 years. But I kept on writing, kept on trying to get published. And this book was my breakthrough book. It was, I got an international multi-book deal. And I was transformed virtually overnight from being an impoverished university student to being an internationally best-selling author. And I've been a full-time author ever since. So, yeah.
It is truly inspirational, Kate, for all the writers. I'm a writer myself now. I'm so excited to say that I am a writer myself, but hearing these sort of stories, it doesn't come without struggle, like no struggle, no progress. And I would say you would have to have gone through those, I hate the word rejections, but those unsuccessful letters that you're receiving to get to where you are. You have to go through that to then get to that success. So it's a remarkable story.
I had to learn my craft, all those books that were rejected in my teens and 20s were not publishable. They weren't good enough. I learned by doing and by making mistakes and by being rejected, and then about trying to learn to do better. And gradually over time, you do get better. And, I think you need that period of, struggle and disappointment first to really temper your soul and to help you learn your craft.
100%. And so, of course, your debut being Dragonclaw, that's correct, from The Witches of
So
Ilion? Yeah.
it was published as Dragonclaw in Australia and The Witches of Ilianan overseas,
Yeah.
and the series is called The Witches of Ilianan. So I generally just call all the books The Witches of Ilianan because it's easier.
Yeah, which is fair enough, completely, and we definitely know what we're talking about there. And so why was it fantasy? What was it about fantasy that made you go there first, other than say contemporary or even romance?
So fantasy has always been one of my favorite genres of fiction to read, particularly when I was a child. I read mainly fantasy, and if I wasn't reading fantasy, I was reading historical fiction. So I say I like books that are set long, long ago and far, far away.
Mhm.
And all of my books, even the historical fiction novels, all have a twist of the uncanny about them. You know, something strange and magical about them. I had been doing this Masters of Arts in Writing, and the books we were given to read were all what was called dirty realism. They were all contemporary. They were all really gritty and dark and, miserable books. And to get
Oh, that was me. Sorry, I lost the network for a second there. Can you hear me? No, all good. We're back
I can
online.
hear you now.
Yeah, yeah.
I saw that you were frozen, but I just kept on talking, honey, because I was sure
That's
you'd
all
come
good.
back to us.
All good. Yes, all good.
Hopefully it wasn't me that was frozen. Yeah. So I was just saying that during my Masters of Arts, I was studying all the books that were, very dark and gritty and contemporary fiction, and I hated them. I didn't like them at all. And so to ease my, to comfort my soul, I was reading an awful lot of fantasy in my spare time. And one day my boyfriend, who's now my husband, said to me, well, all you ever do is read those books. Maybe you should write one. And I went, yeah. And so that's what I did. I began, and my plan was with The Witches of Ilianan was to not put in anything that I didn't like about fantasy, which was mainly, muscular heroes rescuing helpless women and lots of, that kind of thing. And I wanted to put into all the things that I loved, which was like magic, enchantment, danger, romance, strong female characters, things like that. So I just loved writing it. I'd been really struggling with the book that I wrote for my thesis for my master's, but with The Witches of Ilianan, it just poured out of me. It was like a dam had been broken, and the 6 books followed one after the other in pretty quick succession, one a year for the next 6 years.
Wow, that's incredible. One a year for the next 6 years. Whereas meanwhile, I was working on my middle grade novel for 5 years. So it's that's incredible. And I guess every time you've written a book, you're that much more experienced with it since the last one as well.
Yeah,
Definitely.
it definitely makes a difference writing books that are set in a series, because you're dealing with the same world and the same set of characters and the same overarching plot problem, and so the world building has already been done for you. Like I imagine, Annie, you're the same as me, that every time you start a new book, it takes quite a long time to get to know your characters, to understand your structure and your plot and everything else. There's an awful lot of thinking and daydreaming in the early stages of a book. With The Witches of Ilianan, because they were part of a series, I could basically finish one book on a cliffhanger, send it off, and begin work on the next one straight away.
Wow, that's incredible. I love your craft, Kate. So much to aspire to. And you broke away from fantasy and you started writing for children. And so I'm actually very interested to know, was that a challenge transitioning from writing to, say, an older readership to then a younger readership, or did you just have fun with it?
So I'd always wanted to write, so when I was a child, I wanted to be a writer, and I thought I'd write for children. And then when I was a teenager, I thought I'd write for teenagers. And then when I was in my 20s, I thought I would write for readers in their 20s. So The Witches of Ilianen is sometimes categorized as YA fantasy and sometimes as new adult fantasy, which is and sometimes as adult fantasy. My heroine is 16 at the beginning of the book and 24 at the end of the book. So she kind of grows up over the course of the 6 books. I felt no worries about changing to writing for children. I didn't switch though. That's always a bit of a misunderstanding. I've always written for adults and I just alternate between them. So it's not like I was writing for adults and then I suddenly decided I was going to start writing for children, then I only wrote for children. I was always writing both.
Yeah.
So for me, I follow the idea. An idea comes to me and it's all urgent and exciting and galvanizes my imagination. I can't wait to get into it. And then as the story develops, I begin to see who it's meant to be written for. And so some stories are clearly for adults, and some stories are clearly for children. And because I love children's fiction so much, because I've had 3 children of my own, and because I read so much as a child, I don't find it a challenge at all to move from one to the other. It's still me writing. It's just that I'm writing for me when I was 11, or me when I was 7, or me when I was, a very little girl. I can remember who I was, and I can remember what I wanted and how I felt at that time. And so the story demands its own shape. It tells me what it wants to be. I'm never trying to force my story to be something that it's not meant to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It certainly does. It's like the story, you set out to write a story and then it develops on its own. It has a life of its own and it takes you on the journey, not the other way around, it's fascinating. And that's why I always say, Kate Forsyth, versatile writer. She can write for any audience, any readership. And I've read almost all of your stuff, which is I've read it for the children. You've even had a picture book. But my gateway, which I have to touch on because this is my absolute favorite book, Bitter Greens, was my gateway to your work. It is my absolute favorite. Every time someone's asking for a book recommendation, I'm like, Bitter Greens. And that is, of course, I'll let you tell the story, but it's, of course, a fairy tale retelling, Rapunzel in Versailles. That's how I say it. But please do tell us, for those who haven't yet read Bitter Greens, what that's about.
So while my children were all babies and young, I was still writing a lot, and I was mainly writing a lot of children's books then because I had much less time. The year in which all 3 of my children were at school, I call it my golden year, because all 3 of them were in primary school. We had a beautiful little local local school that I could walk them to. Then I could rush home, and for the first time, I could write full time. Up until that time, I'd always worked my writing routine around my children. So I'd had this idea for quite a long time, but I knew it was going to be a big, difficult, dangerous book. And so I saved it up. I was saving it up until I had this golden year to write it. Now, the fairy tale of Rapunzel has haunted my imagination ever since I was about 7. It had all sorts of uncanny parallels with my own life, and I'd always been really strongly drawn to it. I had tried to retell it a couple of times, but it didn't work. And so I've been kind of holding on to it, thinking about it for a very, very long time. I decided to do it as part of a doctorate, so that I could have a length of time to write it. It actually took me about 4 years to read and write, to research and write, which is slow for me. So Bitter Greens is a reimagining of the Rapunzel fairy tale set in Venice and Renaissance Italy, and then it's interwoven with the true life story of the woman who first wrote the tale as we know it. Her name was Charlotte Rose de Caumont de la Force, and she was a noblewoman at the court of Louis XV, at Versailles. She was locked up by the king for her wild and wicked ways, which includes dressing up as a dancing bear to rescue her much younger lover. And so she was banished to a convent by the king, and she wrote Rapunzel while she was a prisoner in this convent. And she wrote it very cleverly and subversively in order to win the favor of the king so that he would release her from her captivity. So there's three narrative threads which to me mimic the braiding of the hair, which is the most memorable motif of the fairy tale. So I have the maiden in the tower, I have the point of view of the witch, and then I have the point of view of the teller of the tale, Charlotte Rose de la Force.
I'm trying so hard not to squeal because this is one of my absolute favorite books ever. And I can understand when you said it was a dangerous book to write. I can see why, because when you read it, it's complex. It's very complex. And if I'm not mistaken, did you go to Europe to study and research this as you were writing this book? Is that I'm sure I read that. Yeah.
I did. So
Yeah.
I took my 3 children because I couldn't leave them behind.
Mm.
And so they were all small. So my daughter was, I think, 7. And then my boys would have been like 9 and 12, 9 and 11, something like that. So we traveled to France. We went to the Chateau de Cazeneuve, which is where Charlotte Rose de la Force was born.
Mm-hmm.
I had to have a translator. The chateau is still in the hands of the family, not of her. She had no descendants. It was inherited by her sister Marie. So her descendants. We went to Venice. We went to the Italian Alps. You know, we traveled everywhere that my characters were. It was an amazing trip. In actual fact, my daughter and I just revisited part of our journey there because she was only 7 when we were in Venice and in Italy, and she couldn't remember it. So I took her back to Venice. It was meant to be, she actually turned 8 while we were in Italy. So it was meant to be 10 years later, but it was actually ended up being 11 years later because we couldn't get our act together fast enough.
Yeah, I remember reading at the back of Bitter Greens, like the work that you put into this book. I was like, wow, this is incredible. Like this is some serious research writing here. And it shows in the book. Like every time someone's asking for a recommendation, I'm always saying Bitter Greens. And of course, so that's like my peak favorite. But of course, we can't forget your other amazing works. So the next book that I read after that was The Wild Girl, followed by The Beast's Garden, if I remember it correctly. So can we touch on The Wild Girl? Because this is a different type of tale. This isn't an actual fairy tale. Well, there is, but it's the person behind the fairy tales.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
in a Bitter Greens, I did something new that has never really been done before, in which I retold a fairy tale, but then I interwove it with biographical fiction, which is the true story of Charlotte Rose de la Force. And I think one of the reasons why that book has done so extraordinarily well for me is because it felt so fresh and unusual. There are other authors who've retold Rapunzel, but not in this way. Now, when I began researching and writing Bitter Greens, I thought that Rapunzel was a Grimm story, and I thought that the Grimm brothers were like old men who traveled around Germany and collected stories from old women at their spinning wheels. And so I imagined that, my teller of the tale would be like an old woman telling the Grimm brothers her true story. But when I had done heaps of research, I realized it wasn't a Grimm story. It was actually much older than that. But I'd done all this research into the Grimm brothers and their true life, and I found this amazing story that I then had to put in my back pocket and keep for about 4 or 5 years while I wrote Bitter Greens. So basically, the Wild Girl is the true life story of the young woman that told the Grimm brothers many of the world's most beloved fairy tales. So she was the old source of stories like Hansel and Gretel and Rumpelstiltskin, the Frog King, the Singing Bone, the Elf and the Shoemaker. dozens and dozens of extraordinary, beautiful stories. She grew up next door to the Grimm brothers. She met them when she was only about 12 or 13, and she became best friends with their little sister, whose name was Lottie Grimm. And so her name was Dortchen Wild, which is spelt wild and means wild. So, at the beginning, I had been kind of planning to weave her story through a fairy tale retelling, but I soon realized that her story was so compelling, so important, and so true that I would have dissipated its power. So instead, I told the story of the stories that she told. So each section of the book is named for and explores one of her key fairy tales, such as Hansel and Gretel, or All Kinds of Fur. Yeah.
One of the key takeaways, I have to say, was her cake. Dortchen's cake. That was very exciting.
It's delicious.
It is.
I love to cook, and I cook a lot. And so there's always a lot of food in my books, and also a lot of gardening, because I love gardens and I'm a very keen gardener, and a lot of music. All the things that I love, I found in my books.
It's very true. That is very true. And we've got such a long list of books that we could go on all night about, and I want to touch on every single one, but I'm so conscious of time. And of course, I want to give the audience a chance to ask them more questions. If they've got any, please put them through the Q&A. So what is it about fairy tales that draws you in? Why do you like to capture the fairy tales? And well, I think we discussed this once before. It's not a fairy tale retelling. It's a historical novel with magical infusion. I think that's what we called it once before. Yeah. But what is it about it that draws you in?
I'll do my best to answer, but the truth is I'm not really sure myself. It's mysterious. To put it simply, I was a little girl who spent a lot of time in hospital. I was sick a lot. And so I spent a lot of time reading, and when I wasn't reading, I was sort of imagining myself into stories. Fairy tales, the Grimm brothers fairy tales were given to me when I was about 7, when I was in hospital, very sick, very sad, very frightened and alone. And they enabled me to escape. Even though my body was imprisoned, inside the hospital, inside those horrible little metal beds with the sides pulled up and machines and drips and things, my soul could fly free through the pages of a book. And I was particularly drawn to fairy tales because they deal with the idea of anything is possible. Anything can happen in a fairy tale. Girls can become bears. Boys can become frogs. Girls who are locked up in towers can escape. This idea of liberation and transformation are integral to fairy tales. And so they gave me great comfort. While I was in the pages of the book, I was elsewhere. I didn't have to deal with the terror of where I really was. And then I came back comforted. Maybe one day I won't be sick anymore, really, is what I took away from them. And what I particularly loved was the danger of them and the beauty of them. I've never really found any other story that so beautifully spins together beauty and peril. And it just really, I have an intensely imaginative and romantic nature. And so I was drawn to that aspect of fairy tales as well. So I read them as a child. As I grew into a teenager, I began to read retellings of fairy tales and a lot of fantasy. And I think me wanting to write them was just a natural continuation of that kind of childhood fascination.
It's true. Like, I think fairy tales or even fantasy gives us that sense of hope and escapism from what we're dealing with. And of course, as a child in a hospital, it's not a very pleasant place. So that gives you something to hold on to, some hope as well. Yeah, definitely. And we thank you for your fascination with fairy tales, because it's produced amazing work, not just for us, but for the world as well, 100%. And you've also collaborated. So you've collaborated with Kim Wilkins on this Silver Well, but most recently, and when I say recent, I mean 2020, with your sister, Searching for Charlotte. Do tell us about that. That was what's that like, collaborating as an author who's usually solo?
Well, I have collaborated quite a lot. So not just with Kim, but also with Lorena Carrington, who illustrates my fairy tale books.
Yep.
And I've got a book of poetry with Wendy Sharp. But writing with my sister was actually so beautiful. My sister and I wrote books together when we were little. So, we have quite a few handwritten manuscripts where you have my very messy scrawl and my sister's very neat handwriting. When we decided to write this book, which was about our great-great-great-great-grandmother who wrote the first children's book published in Australia, we made a few ground rules. So we decided not to blend our voices. We weren't going to be this kind of royal we. I would be Kate, and I would write I and my sister Belinda, and Belinda would be herself and write, I and my sister Kate. And we would each write our own chapters and combine them together. So it was a really beautiful experience. The research was backbreaking, exhausting, and took us much longer than we expected. We started out being afraid there was nothing to find, and then actually discovered that her life was even more extraordinary than we thought so. So the book is called Searching for Charlotte, the fascinating story of Australia's first children's author. She wrote her book and it was published in 1841. So that's 182 years ago. And her life was one of struggle, hardship, heartbreak, and ultimately triumph. It should be a movie. It's an incredible story.
Definitely, or a TV series. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, so would we.
And of course, your sister, shout out to Belinda Murrell, who's also an Australian writer, fantastic storyteller, author of children's books. The one that comes to mind, The Golden Tower, The Ivory Rose. So definitely check her stuff out as well. But that would have been a fantastic collaboration, because especially something that you've done at childhood as well. And now it's actually something that you've published together. It's fantastic.
Yes, and it just keeps on selling and keeps on, gaining new readers.
Sure.
I think we're very pleased with how well it's done. It's been shortlisted for a few prizes. It's always lovely.
Oh, it is lovely and very well deserved, I might add. We have some questions coming through. LT, thank you for your question. LT is curious about your method for collecting all that information from your research. Do you keep a journal or take notes on your computer and start with a manuscript straight away, or do you both? Could I jump in here before you answer, Kate? I remember when we had high tea at Better Read Than Dead all those years ago when you came back from Hong Kong, and you told us about a time, I think you were on a farm or somewhere, where an idea came to you and you're like, oh my God, where's my book? And you ran straight at, people thought you saw a snake, but you ran straight to the house.
Yeah, very true. So I'm a notebooker, which means that I at the start of every book, I buy a beautiful physical notebook, and then it becomes the depository of all my flashes of inspiration, all my ideas, all my questions, all my planning. I like to do this for a number of different reasons. One is because when I began writing, my children were babies. So I was always writing in the cracks of the day. I was, I would write while I was cooking dinner. I would write with the children crawling around my feet. I would write in the park. So I couldn't physically be on a computer all of the time. I had to be able to have something portable that no one would steal, that never ran out of batteries, that the kitty wasn't going to, I don't know, vomit all over. And I love the process so much, I've kept to it. I have a very long gestation period. So a lot of reading, a lot of research, a lot of planning, a lot of what I call daydreaming the story to life. I only begin writing once I have a really strong sense of the narrative arc of the story, and my characters are speaking in my imagination. They've come to sort of vivid and urgent life in my imagination. So once I start writing, I'm very steady, kind of dogged about it. I really put the, draw up the drawbridge, and I just work and work and work and work. And I write relatively swiftly, by which means it still takes me months and months and months, but my books are big. And then the notebook becomes a record of my creative journey. So I often write in it longhand, working out problems, things like that. Yeah.
Yes. And you know what? That is such a wise thing, because I too carry a notebook everywhere. I've got a notebook in my handbag, one on the side table in my bedroom, even my office drawer at work. Sometimes I'm in the middle of doing something and I'm like, oh, idea. Write that down, bank it for later, because it won't run out of battery.
And the ideas are ephemeral. They come and then they go. And then there's, and then you can be haunted by it. I had an idea. I said, what idea was it?
Yes.
Human memory is fallible, and I don't want to lose anything.
Yes.
And also, it really helps me whenever I'm stuck or I'm not sure how to solve a problem. I can go back to my notebook and I can read through my process, and it sparks new ideas for me.
That's true. It's very true. And it's a very good idea to have one. Thank you for that. Lexi Reads is on here. And I have to say, this question is amazing because it's a perfect segue to what I wanted to discuss next. Lexi's very excited to check out Bitter Greens now. Woohoo! Yay! I'm not familiar with your books, but have you ever thought about writing a work inspired by The Little Mermaid? Enter Dancing on Knives.
Yeah.
The stage is yours, Kate.
Okay, so yes, Little Mermaid is one of those fairy tales which has always haunted my imagination. The cruelty in it, the beauty in it, the strangeness of it. I've played around with it in a number of different ways in various of my books, including in The Witches of Ilianan, which has all sorts of fairy tale elements woven into it. However, Dancing on Knives arose out of the book that I wrote for my Masters of Arts in Creative Writing. So it's my only book set in contemporary times and my only book set in Australia. But it kind of, I can't say it's a reimagining of Little Mermaid. It's more like an intertextuality. It's about a girl, a young woman whose name is Sarah, and she feels a strong affinity to the Little Mermaid because she feels out of time, out of place. She suffers from agoraphobia, so severe social anxiety, and so she gradually over time the world narrows around her, and she hasn't left her father's farm in years. She finds it very hard to even leave the house. It's not open spaces that frightens her, it's people. So she's fine when she's kind of wandering on the beach, but she can't cope with seeing people. And so the Little Mermaid becomes a kind of a theme that's woven through. There's also a murder. There's also the ghost of her grandmother and her grandmother's old recipe book, which is all full of Spanish recipes. There's a kind of the story of her grandmother's escape from Spain during this Spanish Civil War. There's art and painting, and there's tarot cards. So Dancing on Knives is a most unusual murder mystery with ghosts and tarot cards and fairy tales.
Yes. And I have to say, I learned a lot about art reading that book. That was the one key takeaway for me as well. Fascinating story. And I love that inspiration, or maybe even a metaphor. It's like Dancing on Ice with a Little Mermaid, 100%. Yes. Thank you for that. Thanks for your question. LT said, thank you. Loves the idea of a notebook for each new project. That's beautiful. So yes, very true. We have another questions come through from Anonymous. Thank you for your question. I absolutely loved Kel Wood's After the Forest and was so excited to hear you'd mentored her through the process. What was it like working with a debut novelist, and do you feel like your styles are similar? Good question. Thank you.
Okay, so I work with a lot of debut authors because I mentor one author every year. So I have worked with a lot in the past, and I will continue. I'm working with one. I'm actually working with two right now. So I love doing this because when I was a young, wannabe writer, I had to do everything on my own. I had no help. It was really difficult. I had to struggle all the time, and all I longed for was for someone to hold out a helping hand. I've known Kel for a really, really long time. I first met her, she was a librarian at the Shoalhaven Libraries, and I went there for a author talk, just like I'm doing with Annie now. And just like Annie, Kel's favorite book was Bitter Greens. And so
I wonder why.
and Kel just was overcome because I was one of her favorite authors, and I'd written her favorite book, and she knew that she wanted to write a book just like, or very similar to Bitter Greens. So we sort of became friends on social media as a result of that first meeting. And then Kel came to the Cotswolds with me. I run a writers retreat every single year in the Cotswolds in the UK. So we we tramp around stone circles, we go and visit castles and gardens, and we do a walking tour of Oxford, and we sit and drink where Tolkien and C.S. Lewis drank. Anyway, she had a week with me in the Cotswolds, and that was when she first began to talk to me about the book that is now called After the Forest. After her week with me, she went to Germany and traveled alone, researching all the places that she went to. When she came back, she actually won a mentorship with me with the Australian Society of Authors. And so I was offered maybe a dozen authors that year, but I picked Kel because it was her manuscript which excited me the most, which I thought had the most potential. Can I tell you, I made her work so hard. She pulled that book apart and put it back together again so many times. I made her do spreadsheets, and gradually over time, this magnificent book emerged, and I knew that it was going to be publishable. So I kept pushing her and pushing her and pushing her to do the work and make it the best it could possibly be. So it's been quite a long, slow process, but I just feel so rewarded and vindicated because it's going to be a smash hit. And I feel, she calls me her fairy godmother. And that's how I feel. I feel like I'm her fairy godmother, and it gives me so much joy to see someone with such a well-deserved, apart from the fact it's going to do really well for her, it's a beautiful book. And that's really what matters. And she has worked so hard for it. So I hope it does brilliantly for her.
Oh, I'm sure it will. And it's like seeing your students graduate high school, seeing Kel get to a publication, I'm sure. And for those who don't know, After the Forest, that's a dark and enchanting fantasy debut by Kel Woods, exploring the repercussions of a childhood filled with magic and a young woman contending with the truth of a happily ever after. And I believe it's set, is it 20 years or so after Hansel and Gretel, the original tale? Is that right?
16 years after.
16 years. Yeah.
15 years after they escaped the witch. So Hansel and Gretel, or Hans and Greta, are now grown-ups and trying to deal with the aftermath of this magical encounter. And can I tell you, I'm actually launching it for Kel like next week. So if you're in Sydney,
Yes,
come along. I can't pronounce it because of my stutter, but it's at Kinua.
Oh, Kinokuniya.
Thank you, darling.
Yeah, that's okay. Kinokuniya Books. On what date?
I'm not sure, but it'll be on my social media and on Kel's social media. I think it's Wednesday. I think it's next Wednesday.
I will definitely try to get myself to that.
Yeah.
That sounds good.
It'd be lovely to be able to see you in person and then give you.
Oh, likewise. I keep seeing you on my screen. I'm like, I have to see you in person. It would be wonderful. Well, congratulations, Kate, because that is much your success as it is Kel's. So fantastic job.
Not at all. All the work. My only contribution was to keep asking her questions and and to keep the faith with her, because it did take a long time, as novels do.
Yeah, it definitely does. Yes. A follow-up to that last question. What an amazing story. Thank you very much for supporting upcoming writers. We all thank you, Kate, for sure. We still have a bit of time, so if anyone has any questions, please send them through. A couple of books that we haven't yet touched on, Kate, The Beast Garden and Beauty in Thorns. Tell us a little bit about that, Beast Garden.
So The Beast Garden is a retelling of the Grimm version of Beauty and the Beast, set in Nazi Germany, which during World War II. So it's set in Berlin, which was the nerve center of the Nazi war machine. It's a very not loose. How can I describe it? It's a very it's not a literal retelling of the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale. I draw upon its structures and symbols to give shape to a story about the German resistance. Nearly everyone in the story, except for my heroine and her key families, are real. They are, the story is inspired by the true life, courage, and sacrifice of Germans resisting Hitler. It starts in 1938 and goes through to the end of the war.
Fantastic. And Beauty in Thorns?
So Beauty in Thorns is about the Pre-Raphaelite circle of poets and artists. Again, it's biographical fiction, and so it tells the lives of 4 women who were poets and writers and artists in their own name, but whose art has been overshadowed by their much more famous husbands. It draws upon Sleeping Beauty. So Edward Burne-Jones was a Pre-Raphaelite artist who was obsessed with Sleeping Beauty. He painted it over and over and over again throughout his life, right from when he was a young man, right up until it was one of his last paintings before he died. And so I tell it from the point of view of his wife and his daughter and his two of his muses.
Fantastic. Yes, that's a very pretty story, I have to say. I loved it.
Yeah, lots and lots of art. If you love art, you've got to follow me, because I am obsessed with the visual arts.
Yes,
and so I write a lot about art and artists.
And it shows in her work. You have, yes, she's not wrong. She's not lying. We've got a couple of books that also I'd like to spotlight, but we do have a question that's come through from Peggy Muliardi. Peggy, thank you for your question. Given that many of the Grimm's brothers fairy tales were told to them by women, do you think we would have known these stories any differently now if these were told by the women directly?
Well, we do have the original oral versions of the stories, or some of them, so we know how they were told. I think it's what you really mean, though, is did the Grimms rewrite the stories? And the answer is yes, progressively over. So the 1812 edition is quite close to the oral sources, and with each edition they edited and rewrote them a little bit more. But by that time, these stories were already very old and had already passed through the hands of many male gatekeepers. So the original oral sources, which we're talking about 2,000 years ago, would have been very, very different before they became, sanitized and retold by men. Fairy tales are generally women's stories. They were usually told by women to women, and they usually have a female protagonist, and they're usually concerned with a women's task, a women's quest. And that is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in them. I love myths as well, but myths often have a male protagonist. And women often don't fare well in myths, and so that's why fairy tales are my first love. If you are interested in reading the original oral versions, Jack Zeitz has done a translation of them and has a collection of them out. It's really thick because there were an awful lot of tales, but it's really interesting, probably more for a scholar than for general reading. But it was a great resource for me when I was writing The Wild Girl.
Fantastic. And it's interesting because this is information we don't normally see or hear as readers as well. So it's fascinating. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for your question. As we're coming to the end of our panel, oh, hang on, we had one more come through. Okay, hang on, let me get this one for you. Anonymous says, Marina Warner's From the Beast to the Blonde is a great academic book on fairy tales too. Have you come across that, Kate?
Oh my God, have I come across it, Annie? I adore
Yes.
that book. You should see my copy of my book. Like, it's annotated with sticky notes. I mean, I can quote large passages from it. I love that book. It's one of my, it's one of the best. So, Anonymous, yes, you are
Yes.
so right.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. A couple of other books I wanted to spotlight, which are your more recent work. So The Blue Rose, of course, followed by your most recent release, The Crimson Thread. If you could tell us about The Blue Rose for those who haven't yet picked that up.
So The Blue Rose is probably my most romantic book. It's I'm based on a Chinese folktale called The Blue Rose. In kind of folklore, a blue rose is an emblem of impossible love. So my story is set in the late 18th century in France during the French Revolution. I have my heroine is the daughter of an aristocrat, and she falls in love with the chateau's gardener. But of course, they are not permitted to be together. And so they, are cruelly torn apart. She thinks that he's dead. She thinks her father has had him killed. And so she then, in great grief and sorrow, has to suffer all through the French Revolution. But he has somehow escaped miraculously. And he sets out on a journey to discover the fabled red rose of China, which has been rumored and appears in myth and folklore, but has never been seen. So he joins an embassy, a British embassy that sails all the way to China, and then is the first Westerners to really penetrate behind the bamboo curtain. So they go and meet the Chinese emperor and end up being, having to escape under a third of their lives. So it's a very romantic sort of swashbuckling adventure story split between these two voices. The young woman who is, seeing Marie Antoinette's head being chopped off and all the other terror of the French Revolution, and her lover, who she thinks is dead, who's on this amazing journey into 18th century China. Fantastic book to write. I obviously had to go to France. I obviously had to go to China, where I'd never been before. And because it's based on this very little known fairy tale, it gave me great freedom to interpret it as I pleased.
And it is a beautiful story, and I had the pleasure of launching that book at Galaxy Bookshop when it first came out in 2019. So it's a very beautiful story. Definitely get your hands on that if you haven't read that. And your most recent one, The Crimson Thread, that's only just come out last year. Tell us about that one.
Yes, it's doing so well for me. So The Crimson Thread is a reimagining of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth myth set in Crete during World War II. So I don't know how well you know this ancient myth about the man with the bull's head who's trapped in this kind of dark labyrinth underneath this ancient palace, and his half sister Ariadne helps the Greek hero Theseus to this. She gives him the secret of the labyrinth. She holds one end of a crimson thread, and he unrolls this ball as he winds through the labyrinth and finds and kills the Minotaur. So once again, mine is not a literal retelling. There are no bull-headed boys in my book, but it is about the underground resistance to the Nazis in Crete, which is where the myth originated. It's a story of love, of resistance, of defiance, of betrayal, of incredible courage. It's inspired by the story of my own great uncle who fought in the Battle of Crete, and along with thousands of other Australian soldiers, many of whom were trapped on the island and taken prisoner, or who went into hiding and were kept hidden by the very brave Cretan people.
Definitely, yeah. That admittedly, this is one I have to pick up, and it's only because I've been on deadline. I haven't read that one just yet. But I remember hearing about that when we launched the Blue Rose, and I was like, oh my goodness, I have to read this soon. And for
Summer
everyone else
holidays.
listening in,
Summer holidays, Annie. This
yes,
summer holidays
yes,
is when we all catch up on our reading, isn't it? I'm way
100%,
behind
yes.
my reading too.
Mine is too. I know. It's like, oh, it's shocking. I have to catch up with it. But unfortunately, that's where we have to start winding it up. Otherwise, I would love to talk to you all day, Kate, because you are a fantastic storyteller. I love listening to you talking. And also for the audience with your questions, thank you so much for sharing and your comments as well. One thing I'd like to ask you, if you can tell us, Kate, what is next, if you can tell us?
Oh, I'm so glad you've asked, Annie, because I'm actually so excited. I've delivered my next novel to my publisher. I'm just waiting to get back my final editorial report. I have seen the cover. It's divine. I'm not allowed to share it yet, but I will be soon. I'm really going back to my fantasy roots here, and it's a retelling of an ancient Greek myth called Cupid and Psyche, which is probably my favorite, one of my favorite of the ancient myths. And it's a literal retelling. So in the story, Psyche, she betrays her god lover, and then she has to journey to the underworld and meet Persephone and the god of the dead, and then come back into the, and so in Psyche, she actually goes to the underworld. She actually meets Aphrodite, and though it's really a Roman myth. So we're talking about Venus, and
And when can we get this?
it's out May 28th next year.
Oh, that is such a long way to go. But it'll be here before we know it, so
I know.
I can't complain.
I mean, think how fast this year's gone past. And I've had my head down, tail up, writing this book for months, and I'm so excited. We're so close to finishing it.
Oh, I'm so excited for you, and I cannot wait. And I'm probably going to get in contact with you to say, Kate, I've called dibs on your book launch. I'm going to be emceeing you once again. So, congratulations, Kate. I can't wait for that to come out. And you really speak to me there with fantasy. So, I'm very excited for that one.
Anyone who wants to see the absolutely gorgeous cover, keep an eye on my social media, because as soon as I'm allowed to, I'll be sharing it.
I can't wait. I'll be following your Instagram and socials for a while. My last question before we close it out, Kate, is there a tale or a fairy tale that you haven't yet tapped into that you would love to and write a story on? What would that be?
Absolutely. I always have so many ideas for stories, and more than I'll ever be able to write. I think I'm very interested. The next book I'm going to be writing will be drawing on Scottish fairy tales and Scottish folklore, and this time of Mary Queen of Scots.
Ooh.
So I'm just beginning to think about that one now. I've bought my notebook. I filled in 3 pages of it. That's how far in I am. I love the story of Wild Swans, and that's one I'd like to explore if I could. So many. It just depends how many books I've got left in me to write, really.
Well, I mean, the expectation and the want is definitely there, but of course, you've got to go at your own pace and you've got to do what's right for you. So, I can't wait to read all that stuff. That's exciting. So, Kate, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. It was an absolute pleasure to share the virtual stage with you once again, and to hear about all your books and to hear all your answers to amazing questions. So thank you once again. I can't wait to see you again in person. Once again, to Book for Australia, thank you so much for putting this together and to bring the community together online. We're doing very well with that. And very importantly, I just wanted to give a very big thank you to the Book Fair Australia sponsors, without whom we would not be here. So huge shout out to our silver sponsors. We've got Booktopia, Book Addiction, and Virtual Room, and our bronze sponsors, Ingram Spark, Awaken Fables, Calligraphic Print, Better Read Than Dead, who is the store at the convention on 14-15 October, and Selena Fennick as well. So to the crew and to Ivana Triglia, our CEO and director, thank you so much for all the hard work work in putting this together for your readers here in Sydney and far and wide. To the attendees for being here, thank you very much. And once again, Kate, sending love to you. Thank you so much.
And thank you everyone for joining us. I so hope you've enjoyed our chat.
Oh, I certainly did. And once again, sorry technology wasn't a friend of mine today, but we got there.
It's all right. We're all used to it. We know what it's like.
Thank you once again. You have a wonderful evening, Kate. I hope to see you
Bye.
soon. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.